Right, ladies and gentlemen, I'm sorry I'll have to ask for your attention. I'd like to get this next session underway, which in the program is a regulatory panel session, and my intention will be to introduce our panel and then ask them to do their short executive summary, and then I'll be presenting them with some prepared questions from here, and hopefully we'll have time then to ask some questions from the floor. And based on the last session, I'm sure there's going to be a few interesting questions. So it gives me a great deal of pleasure to be able to introduce in the order of the panellists that are sitting at the table, Dr. Bronwyn Evans. Dr. Evans is the CEO of Standards Australia, as I'm sure most of you know, and chair of the MTP Connect, the Industry Growth Centre for Medical Technologies and Pharmaceuticals. She's also the Vice President of Finance of the International Standards Organisation, a Director of the Australian-Japan Foundation, and in fact she's just flown in from Japan this morning, arriving back in Australia at 8:20 a.m, so it's great to have you here, Bronwyn. We appreciate your effort. She's a member of the Prime Minister's Task Force and has had over 35 years' experience in various engineering roles. She's an Honorary Fellow of the Institute of Engineers Australia, a Fellow of the Australian Academy of Technological Sciences and Engineering, and a graduate of the Australian Institute of Company Directors. And if that's not enough, in 2014-15 she was recognised as one of Australia's 100 most influential engineers, and in 2016 was recognised as an Australian Financial Review Westpac 100 in the 100 Women of Influence. So well done, Bronwyn, and great to have you along today. We also have Neil Savery, who I'm sure is no stranger to most of you. Neil is the Chief Executive of the Australian Building Codes Board, and he's championed in his term there improved access, awareness and understanding of the National Construction Code. And prior to this, Neil was Deputy Commissioner of the Victorian Building and Plumbing Industry Commissions, where he's responsible for the day-to-day management of the organisation and helping develop a number of reforms, resulting in the establishment of the Victorian Building Authority, which we have today. Neil holds qualifications in town planning, urban design and ecological sustainable development, and is a registered planner and a graduate of the Australian Institute of Company Directors. So thank you very much for your time today, Neil. I'm sure there's lots of demands of your time currently as well, so thank you. We also have Dr. Carol Grossman. Carol is the Director of Australia's Water Efficiency Labelling and Standards Program, who's just recently flown back from the United States, where she spoke at the Emerging Technology Symposium on the whole water efficiency arrangement across the world. So it'll be interesting to hear later on what's happening on a global basis, but I think generally speaking it's accepted that with wells, Australia's pretty much leading the world. She's held the position with the Wells Unit since July 2016, has been a professional public servant for about 10 years in water resources and land management areas. She also holds a PhD in biochemistry from the University of Wisconsin and moved from the USA to Australia in 1991 to take up a research position at the Commonwealth Scientific and Industrial Research Organisation, and also served as a lecturer at the Canberra Institute of Technology. Areas of experience include climate change, agriculture, natural resource management, land sector, greenhouse gas accounting, international negotiations, implications of coal seam gas development. So great to see you along here today too, Carol. Thank you very much for your time. And I'm also pleased to be able to introduce Dr. James Galloway, who's currently the CEO of the Joint Accreditation of Australia and New Zealand, or more commonly known as JAS-ANZ. And prior to this, he worked with the National ICT in Australia Research Organisation, the Australian Electrical and Electronic Manufacturers Association, Spectrum Management Agency and Department of Industry, Technology and Commerce. These roles have mainly been concerned with standards, conformity assessment and regulation. Over the course of employment, he has held a variety of standards and conformance related appointments, including with Standards Australia and International Technical Commission. He has an undergraduate qualification in Doctor of Philosophy from the University of Adelaide, Master's degree in Government and Commercial Law from the Australian National University, and graduate certificate in Risk Management from Swinburne University of Technology. So welcome to you. James, thank you very much for your time today. So now with this particular session, I'm going to invite our panellists to provide a brief overview of the challenges that they're currently facing in their roles and with their organisations, and then I will be presenting each of them with some prepared questions for their response, and hopefully at the conclusion of that we'll have some opportunity to get questions from the floor. So I'll invite Dr. Bronwyn Evans to speak to us. Thank you.
Good morning, and thank you for that invitation. I thought I'd talk not only about the challenges but also the opportunities that we've got at Standards Australia. And I think if I hit the red button, things are going to change. Yes. So we're 96 years old this year. We were formed in 1922, and we really coordinate the work of great people like you who come onto our committees and help us bring that expertise into the world of standards, and very particularly in this sector in what we call the plumbing code. We've been undergoing a really important review in the last six or so months, which we call our technical governance review. We get, and rightly so, we've had a lot of criticism about our processes. We're not fast enough. The way that we incorporate people could be improved. So we commissioned an independent group, Cameron Ralph Curry, to do a review of our governance of our committees, essentially. And the main finding was, look, you're making changes, but tell you what, you're not changing fast enough for community expectations. And they had about 66 written contributions and around about 20 interviews. And distilling all of that information, they said there's 3 areas that you need to improve on. You need to be more open, you need to be more strategic, and you need to have better quality control. So what that means is we need to take that information and say, what are we going to do about it? Because it was very clear when you get a report like this, it's not an option to do nothing. And we see that time after time when a report comes out, there's a lot of excitement, but we needed to make this real. And our board, Friday of last week, no, the week before, approved the budget for our initial phase of implementation. And I'll tell you some of the things in later slides that we're doing about being more innovative as well. And that's through the incubator. Some of you may have seen us when we launched the incubator at our council meeting in November last year. And what we've done is we've created an innovation incubator to pilot stuff, because you don't want to blow up the shop while you're trying to make improvements. We have to be able to keep making our standards while we're innovating, and the incubator is the place to do that. One of the very first projects that we've started is working with someone who may be well known to you, is certainly well known to Jeff, and that's Jerry Tyrrell. Some years ago, Jerry famously went to a conference and had a coffin that said, Standards Australia RIP. Or when someone does that to you, you say, Jerry, come and talk, because I don't want to see this at the next conference. So Jerry came and said, your standards are too wordy. No one reads them, no one understands them. I've got an idea about how you can be better. So we worked with Jerry, and this is a pilot we've been working on and it's at proof of concept stage at this stage at the moment. How can we be more visual? How can we be more attuned with the way people actually want to consume information? So this project's going along very well. And we're looking then also, how do we get it out to the end user? What are the ways? And that's where we're looking at, can we do it in an app on phones and all that other fancy stuff that you have in your pocket? So I would say watch this space. And again, if you've got an idea for a project that can go through the incubator, we'd love to hear from you as well. So just as Jerry very loudly said, you're not good enough, and here's the way I think you should change. It was by working with someone like him that we said, yep, we get it. We get what the future needs to be. Thank you.
Thank you, Bronwyn. I'd now like to introduce Neil Savery to address you.
Thanks, Stuart. Thanks for having me. I'm going to talk from the table. I've got 4 topics that I'll quickly take you through, which I imagine are very relevant to you, and in fact the previous panel touched on a couple of them. The first is lead in drinking water. So, as has been mentioned, the ABCB has commissioned a research project, and I think it's really important to stress the fact that it is only a research project. One of the key things that the ABCB does as part of its work is establish an evidence base. So you don't just go and change regulation on the basis of a knee-jerk reaction to an issue, or that there's some pressure applied to the political process. There actually has to be an evidence base. And through that, you can then also determine the potential costs and benefits of any regulatory change that might result from that. For those of you who aren't aware, Professor Mark Taylor, who's a recognised expert in this field from Macquarie University, is the individual, or his team has been commissioned by the ABCB to undertake that research. That's at a very late stage in its development, so we hope to be taking some material to our Plumbing Codes Committee at its next meeting to get some further advice from them on the research findings and recommendations, which may or may not lead to further work being undertaken, depending on what the outcomes of that particular body of work are. Now, obviously, this has been triggered by some events, as Ivan referred to, catastrophic events potentially in some cases, but fortunately, we actually haven't had an event that we know of that has resulted in significant health risks to the population from elevated levels of lead in drinking water. But the potential obviously exists from the things that have occurred around the country. The next one is the point of sale for Watermark. Now, everyone would be aware that at the moment Watermark is enforced through point of installation by the states and territories. The ABCB is not the enforcer of the Watermark scheme in terms of the application of products. Products being put in the ground by plumbers is a matter for states and territories to regulate. Obviously, the question that's been raised is, could that be done more effectively and possibly more efficiently at point of sale? Now, the issue becomes very difficult when you bear in mind that the regulators, that is the 8 states and territories, have made clear that they will not give up point of installation. So the question then becomes, well, it's point of sale in addition to point of installation. That raises a whole host of issues around how you resource that, when I think I heard some comments already this morning that some of the regulators are already stretched with their resources to be able to do point of installation. So if you've got point of installation and point of sale, how are they going to resource both of those things? That's obviously just one issue around the practicality of the exercise. Nevertheless, we engaged AIFA to assist us in undertaking stakeholder engagement. We went around the country, met with a number of groups. Certainly the industry bodies that are here today have had significant representation in that consultation, and have also had the opportunity to make submissions to us and to AIFA, and we will work our way through that. The intention is to take a paper to the board at its coming meeting in June, and that would potentially then go to the Building Ministers Forum for their consideration, because keep in mind, this ultimately involves legislative change. So it's not something the ABCB can institute, only the states and territories can do it through their legislation, so they've got to be willing partners in the exercise. Watermark technical specifications. Those of you who have attended these forums previously would have heard me say that part of our ongoing program of the review and ultimately the delivery of the new Watermark scheme involves a review of the Watermark technical specifications. And many of you may be more familiar with the term Australian Technical Standards, because they were those standards that the ABCB inherited when the scheme was transferred from Standards Australia, and ATSs continue to be developed. They are acceptable under the watermark scheme, but progressively we are translating and transferring everything across to watermark technical specifications, but many of those have significant history to them. They haven't been looked at for a considerable period of time. Some of them may in fact be redundant. Others simply need to be updated. So we've got to progressively go through those, and there are literally hundreds of watermark technical specifications. So we estimate that's going to take us between 3 to 4 years to review all of those technical standards. At the same time, there's going to be new ones occurring as innovation happens in the marketplace. One of the key things that we will be doing is engaging with relevant parties in the review of those technical standards. We won't just do that in-house. We have to engage with the sector to understand if they need to be changed, whether they're still contemporary and are required through that process. And then the last is the Plumbing Code of Australia. For those of you who aren't familiar, the National Construction Code, which includes the Plumbing Code as Volume 3, has just been, a new edition of that has just been released for public comment. That public comment period closed a few weeks ago. That is the end of the opportunity for public comment on NCC 2019. What we now do is evaluate all of those comments. We take it to our technical committees, that's the Building Codes Committee and the Plumbing Codes Committee. We invite them to give us advice on any of the proposed changes that arise out of public comment. And then depending on that, we will develop a final draft of the public comment draft. We take that back to the October meeting of the technical committees, and provided their advice is consistent with the changes, we take it to the board in November for the board to agree to. And on the basis that the board agrees, the code, the amendments will be adopted in May 2019. That will be the next edition you see of the Plumbing Code. Just quickly, 2 key features of the Plumbing Code for 2019 are the introduction of Australian, now I've forgotten the term, but Australian construction practices, Australian plumbing practices, acceptable plumbing practices, sorry. Acceptable plumbing practices are practices that the plumbing industry undertakes and has undertaken for generations and have been assessed as being acceptable as meeting the requirements of the code. And they typically don't require any reference to an Australian standard or any other form of reference standard. If you follow the plumbing practice requirements, you meet the requirements of the code. And they apply to warm and cold water services, sanitary plumbing and drainage. The other thing is we've introduced the readability principles to Volume 3. 19 of 20 principles have been applied to improve the readability, the legibility, the logic of working your way through the Plumbing Code of Australia. And many comments that we've received back relate to those particular changes, so it'll be interesting to see where we end up with that. Thanks, Stuart.
Thank you very much, Neil. Appreciate that. I'd now like Dr. Carol Grossman to address coming up here.
Bear with me.
Oh, there we go. Sorry, I've jumped ahead now.
Yep. There you go.
All right, great, thanks. So I've really just got a handful of slides. I want to talk through some of the key issues that I think are pertinent for this group, changes that we've had in Wells. But before I jump into that, I do want to just kind of remind people that for most people in this room, Wells is just another regulatory hurdle that they need to get through. But it is a really effective program in terms of saving water in Australia. And that's got benefits for consumers who save on their water and power bills. But it's also got a lot of benefits for us as a community. So people think of it as an environmental program. But if you look at the cost of water infrastructure in Australia, organizations like Sydney Water really value Wells because it allows them to postpone developing more infrastructure, reduces the amount of water that they need to supply. So it's got a lot of benefits. So, as I said, I've just got about 4 items that I wanted to run through with you. One is about streamlining registration processes by allowing, people have been asking for a long time for a single process for getting their watermark certification and their wells registration. And we've been looking at this and considering it, and the most logical approach in this case seems to be probably the simplest approach as well, which is to encourage the watermark cabs to offer handling the wells registration on behalf of their clients. So the wells legislation already does allow for an agent to complete the registration process on someone's behalf. So essentially we think the cabs are well positioned to do that because they've already got the required documentation. Wells registration requires a test report, watermark certificate, photo image of the item. So those things would already be on hand. So to progress that, we've scheduled a couple of sessions to talk to the watermark cabs. I think we've got 5 of the 8 cabs are coming to one of our sessions. First one is in Sydney this Thursday, and the next one's next week in Melbourne. So another issue that's timely is the transition to our new labels. So we had a change in our label design come in 2016, and we established some transitional arrangements whereby for a certain period products could use the old label or the new label. That's changing on 21st of July of this year, so we're asking people to transition to the new label. Now, we do understand that this presents some challenges, because in a perfect world, stock has turned over, but we don't live in a perfect world, and there will be some old stock out there. And we have heard from some people already who are getting pushback from retailers wanting their suppliers to take products back because they no longer have the valid label. We would encourage people to take a common sense approach and where it's possible, providing new labels, updated labels for old floor stock would be one way to deal with that. And I think would be less cost than trying to take products back. Having said that, it presents a little bit of an issue for us as well, because we do take a risk-based approach to compliance, which means that we look at issues that are of the greatest risk to the scheme. So if we go in and we find a business that has a lot of old labels, we'll have a look at that, because sometimes that sort of thing is symptomatic of broader non-compliance. And if that's part of a whole picture of products where registration has expired, products which maybe weren't registered in the first place, and so forth, we'll follow up. But we do understand that if a business is broadly compliant, but there are a couple of old stock items with an old label, that's probably not where we're going to pull out all the heavy guns and put all our efforts in. We've got bigger fish to fry than that. And I will try to get a news item on our website that kind of sets that out, so you've got somewhere to point to on that. One of the things we're really excited about is this process has now started for developing an ISO international standard for water efficiency labeling. So we've gotten that positive vote through ISO. Standards Australia has established ISO has established a project committee, PC 316. Standards Australia will hold the secretariat for that, and Steve Cummings will be the chair of the committee. There are 14 countries who've signed up as of this time to participate, and the first meeting of that ISO committee will be in Sydney on the 24th to the 26th of July. Now there's also a process for having feed-in from Australian industries. So a number of you are from agencies that have are linked to organizations that have representation on WS-032, which is the committee that manages the wells standard. That committee has been established as the Australian Mirror Committee for the process. So that group is now working on some documents to put into the process, preparing a submission. So there's a few people in this room who are busy working on that as well. The process is expected to take probably 2, maybe 3 years. And as Stuart said, I've just come back from the Emerging Water Technology Symposium in the US. And a large part of the reason for going was that there was a session on different countries' water efficiency labeling schemes. And sitting together with them and going through how this could work was really important in terms of getting the owners of the other programs on board with the idea that we can develop a standard that will create a lot more uniformity for business, but also work with all of our existing programs. So we can keep wells running pretty much the way it does with maybe a few adjustments. WaterSense in the US will be able to maintain their program. Obviously, we'll all have to make some adjustments to align, but we think we can do that in a positive spirit of cooperation and come at something that ultimately benefits industry by that more consistency internationally. And the last thing I wanted to talk about was our compliance and enforcement, because we think we're making some real headway there. We've done some work behind the scenes to create a more structured approach. So we've established what we call escalation pathways, which basically say when we find someone who's not compliant in a typical situation, we start out with education. If that doesn't work, we move towards formal warnings. And then we can step it up to more formal approaches like remedial action notices and audits that require people to take stock and fix what they've got there. And then infringement notices. And for a corporation, a single infringement notice is now worth $6,300. And after that, we can consider court action. So I've just popped up a few statistics. In the past 12 months, we've given out 6 infringement notices for a total of over $32,000. We've given out 1 remedial action notice. 6 notices to provide information, which is mainly gathering information. So if we do take somebody to court, we've got what we need. And those are compulsory, and there are criminal penalties for people who don't comply with those notices. So we do have some power in our act. Some of the other things, we've been looking at the building industry, which also needs to comply with Wells legislation, and looking at 98 new building display suites. We found pretty close to 100% non-compliance with Wells labeling information. So we've worked with the industry on how they can do that. So it's often not a matter of labeling the products that are in a display suite, it's making sure that the inclusions lists and information that the prospective buyers get includes water efficiency. That's important because if we're to encourage people to use more efficient appliances, knowing that they have to put on their inclusions list that it's going to have a 4-star mixer tap in the kitchen or a 3-star shower, gives them an incentive to make sure they source product that's going to be efficient. The follow-up, of course, is can we then look at the other end and look at what they've installed, and that's a challenge. But out of those display suites, 76 have now become compliant. 17 are working with us. There are 5 that have not responded initially, so we may have to escalate those. And then also looking at, from the start of the year, this year we've looked at contacted 66 entities that had non-compliant websites. So we do some searching of websites and we do some referrals from the public, and we respond to those and we look. And out of those 66, 27 became compliant in what we refer to as phase 1. So we're just trying to work with them cooperatively, phone calls and emails. 7 have become formal warning letters, have been given formal warning letters. And 3 of those woke up and went, ooh, we better do this. 4 of those are still in process. And there are 32 that we're still working with. So it's sort of like a funnel where you start with a lot and most of them fix it through the more cooperative processes, and then some get to the pointy end. We've also found some cases of people falsifying information. We found some falsified watermark certificates and various other things. So we think our stronger approach is bearing fruit. So thank you for that.
Thank you very much, Carol, and I think that everyone in the room would be very pleased with the way the Wells program's going with respect to the water savings that have been generated in our communities and the value that provides. I think it's fair to also say that many of us have been passionate about the issue and the ability of the plumbing industry to actually have an impact on water use across Australia, particularly in the built environment. And I know, for example, in Western Australia in the early 1990s, we introduced a program called Directions 2000, a water efficiency strategy for the plumbing industry. And following that, there was the development of the Green Plumber program, which then became a franchise operation on a worldwide basis. So in many ways, the industry led government and politicians in developing initiatives and programs for water efficiency in Australia. But it's great to see the success of the Wells program, and it would be interesting hearing more about it. So now it's over to Dr. James Galloway. Thank you very much for your turnout today.
Look, I'll start by talking a little bit about JAS-ANZ and I'll finish up talking about some of the challenges that we see in terms of the future development and application of the watermark scheme, particularly in terms of JAS-ANZ's role within the scheme. So the first thing to understand about JAS-ANZ is that we're a creation of both the Australian and New Zealand governments. We're not entitled to call ourselves servants of the Commonwealth or servants of the Crown in New Zealand. We're an organisation that both governments have an interest in. We're established to do four things. One is to maintain a joint accreditation system around the confidence that goods and services certified or inspected by accredited bodies meet established standards. We're to obtain and maintain acceptance by Australia and New Zealand's trading partners for domestic management systems and exported goods and services. We're to create links to overseas bodies that establish or recognise standards for goods and services or that provide conformity assessment. And finally, we're obliged to maintain some sort of degree of mutual recognition. We're required to maintain ourselves at a level which means that other countries will recognise the output of the accreditation system. We're not a regulator. That's another really important thing to understand. So the question often arises, well, how do you do what we do? Well, we basically do it through a system of contracts. Right? We enter into a relationship with a conformity assessment body through a deed of standing offer. And that provides a whole series of enforceable rules and undertakings, and they define the terms under which we grant or take away accreditation from a certification body based on their performance. Underneath that deed, there are various things that sit to give effect and application to the deed in particular domains. We have an accreditation manual, which can be described as a solution set for how to satisfy the contractual terms in the deed of arrangement. Underneath that, you might find scheme rules, such as the watermark scheme, and underneath that, you might find a body of specific standards that apply to particular products, processes, personnel, or whatever the case might be. It's often the case that people ask, what's the relationship between JAS-ANZ and certifiers? And some people will ask me a question, because I came from industry associations, they'll say, are they your members? Well, the answer to that is no, they're not our members. Some people will ask, are they your customers? Well, no, they're not our customers. If anyone's our customer, it's the scheme owner, in this case, the Australian Buildings Code Board, or by extension, the end users of certification. Okay? We tend to see ourselves as establishing, if you like, a licensing arrangement, an authorisation regime, by which, going through a process leading to accreditation, we authorise a certification body to represent themselves as having a particular level of skill or competence, and that's really where it sits. We do have a fairly extensive process of assessment that we apply to watermark caps, indeed all caps, and I'll talk a little bit about that later. But for the time being, let me just draw 2 points out about that. Assessment results in general tell us that cabs are quite capable and able to maintain their system in line with the conditions of accreditation and the standards they're required to operate on. We don't have any difficulty with that as a result of information coming to us from our assessment processes. However, we in recent years have spent a lot more time looking at market surveillance. And one of the interesting things, or challenging things for us, is there's a gap. There's a gap from what you can learn from assessment when you line that up with what you learn from the market. And you learn from the market by talking to individual suppliers or talking to industry groups, by looking at the end results of what comes from the application of the certification process. And our main concern is to look at how we close that gap. So the challenges for us, I think I'll summarise them, but probably touch on them a little bit as we go through this session. Open up engagement between JAS-ANZ and certificate holders. Traditionally, accreditation and certification are built around a dual relationship between the accreditation body and the certifier. I think that misses out a very important party, and that is the certificate holder. We have a lot to say to certificate holders, and I think certificate holders have an awful lot to say to us. And if we can close that gap through a program of engagement and perhaps even services to certificate holders, then I think we're contributing to improved performance of the system as a whole. Another challenge for us is that we're, if you like, experts in process logic. Right? We look at the organisation. We do what we call process-based assessment. We ask questions about the internal dynamics of the organisation, the application of its systems and procedures through its auditors, and we make judgments about the organisation at a process level. When we do our assessments, we generally take people who we call technical experts with us. In the past, we've generally used regulators in connection with Watermark. I see that there's a great deal of scope to use a higher level of technical skills in some of these assessments than typically we've been able to obtain through contributions from regulators. I think there needs to be some sort of open discussion about the issue of performance. I've said that from an assessment point of view, we see cabs as being, if you like, on a curve, on a distribution. There are outliers, there's no doubt about that. But looking at the assessment parameters, the existing body of cabs operate above an acceptable benchmark. I'm very interested in the idea of how does feedback from the market confirm or disconfirm that, and perhaps change our views about the actual performance of a given certification body. And that goes back to that point I made earlier, that it's important for us to break away from just this dualistic notion about who's involved in the accreditation system. Another point that is very important for us, and this is generally right across the accreditation framework, is how do we help certificate holders make better decisions about which cab to use. There's no question that it's a trash market for certifications, and that trash market gets serviced. If the demand is there, someone's going to service it. We see it in management systems, we see it in some areas of product, and it needs to be dealt with. At the moment, what we're thinking about is bringing together information from a variety of different sources to actually create a ranking system of cabs. That's possible, that's feasible, and we've got some well-advanced work with Monash University to help us develop an algorithm that would weight information from different sources to give us that ranking system. Now that has implications, not just for the cabs, but also for the users of their services, and I'll be interested to see how people react to that idea. We need to rethink some aspects of product certification. I think one of the most important is to look at customised tools and methods. We work in the world of standards, okay? And the world of standards is dominated by, if you like, averages, means, and standardised performance. I tend to find that somewhat lacking when you take those basic ideas and parameters and try and apply them in particular domains. I think one of the challenges for us is to look at how we can develop and apply customised tools and methods to the different domains that we work in. Certification decision review. The world that we live in makes the certification body fundamentally solely responsible for its certification decision. We've seen a few instances recently where we certainly would ask questions about how that certification decision was reached and whether in fact it was a valid certification decision. Our response to that is to look at what we call a product reference group, which is where we would bring peers and experts together to look at a certification file and ask the question, would someone else equally as skilled in the art have made a decision to certify that product? And we're actually trialling that method now in the COMARK context. Feedback into testing and standards writing. I don't mean to knock test laboratories, and I don't certainly mean to knock standards writers, but some of the biggest difficulties we face are in test results, which are the basis for certification, and also to some extent standards. Not that standards are bad, but standards are open to interpretation. In Watermark, we have the mechanism to actually try and moderate those interpretations. In other areas that we work, we don't have that. And I think it's absolutely critical when we think about operations in a global context that we can find some way of having a very effective feedback to settle some of the ambiguous questions that exist around testing and certification and standards. Last 2 points quickly, Stuart. For us, it's all about maintaining a degree of rigour within Watermark without risking innovation and open markets. That's essentially the challenge that we face as an organisation. And finally, I guess the question of tackling avoidance. There's no question that there are suppliers out there who will do what they can to avoid their obligations with respect to being able to demonstrate conformity of their product. I'm not sure that it's entirely an issue that JAS-ANZ can tackle on its own, but it's one that we do have a vital interest in.
Thank you very much, Dr. Galloway. We appreciate that. And very much appreciate the contribution from each of our panellists at this point. And my intention now, ladies and gentlemen, is to put some prepared questions to each of the panellists. And I'll also be inviting them, because there will be some crossovers, and you'll even notice that in the questions prepared, compared with some of the responses already received in their presentations, to respond if they want to add something to the reply. So I'll be starting with Dr. Bronwyn Evans from Standards Australia. Dr. Evans, Australia's been successful in securing international support for the establishment of a new international organisation for standardisation, ISA Project Committee on Water Efficiency. This follows a decision in February 2018 by the ISA Technical Management Board, which voted to support the Australian proposal. What do you see as the benefits of this initiative?
Thank you, and we heard a lot about the program with Carol's presentation, but importantly, what it means is for Australia, a lot of the work that we've already done has been recognised as an exemplar of best practice, and I certainly want to thank everyone in the room who's involved in any elements of our standards, and certainly Steve Cummings, who's chairing this work, and the people on the Mirror Committee. But I think you made the point about some of the efficiency work is impacting water use nationally. This is an opportunity to impact water use internationally. And it also means for companies, it's accessing international markets. It's the ability to have product differentiation. And for governments, it's a way to address priority areas of good water use practices. And if you look at the UN Sustainable Development Goals, I think it's SDG 6, which is around clean water and safe sanitation. And it's about using our water appropriately. And of course, for consumers, it's about choice, and it's also about reduced water bills. So there's some really practical things. So the opportunity to take the really good work that's already happened in Australia to an international market is important, and we've done that in a number of areas. We worked very hard with our regional partners, and a lot of the reason I was in Japan was at the Pacific Area Standards Congress. We work with those members of ISO to make sure that the projects that we want to promote get understood by our regional standards partners and then supported as we go into this process. So it is an important project, and as Carol pointed out, the next steps, now that it's been approved, is to have the very first meeting in Sydney in late July. And I certainly want to commend Carol and everyone who was involved with us in bringing this project to the world.
Thank you. Carol, did you want to add anything?
I think pretty much
Covered it?
Yeah, I think Rowan has pretty much covered it. We're very excited about it, and we do have we have had interest from other countries all along. And I'll just add one example is that about 2 years ago, well staff met with a delegation from the Ministry of Water Resources in China, and China started a well scheme that's based on ours 1st of March of this year. So there is interest, and I think having that standard will make it easier for other countries to pick up on it as well.
Thank you, Carol. Another question to Bronwyn. What progress has Standards Australia made in facilitating the early availability of free online access to mandated Australian standards affecting the plumbing industry?
Now, don't you like to give us controversial questions? Yes, Stuart. I'm glad I got that one well in advance. And of course, better access to standards is a priority of ours. Right now, and I think everyone in this room will appreciate, the distribution of standards is through SAI Global with their pricing as their remit. But we know that different distribution arrangements are expected and quite frankly demanded in the future. It's in the public domain, but the current distribution arrangements with SAI Global come to an end at the end of this year, with a number of caveats, and we're working very hard on our distribution arrangements for January next year and beyond. And we've got a set of principles that our board has endorsed and we're working on, which includes better access to standards. It includes many more. It includes better use of our content. And you saw in my presentation the work that we're doing with Jerry Tyrrell in the incubator, to not just give you back words, and I think to James's point, words that can be interpreted and misinterpreted, but to present information in a very visual way. So I don't see in the immediate future that we'll be giving away all of the standards for free, but I do see there will be a range of different arrangements where we can work with industry associations, where we can work with other groups to get our content out in a way that's appropriate and gets better access to standards. So, not quite yet.
Thank you. And perhaps a slightly easier, more practical question. Can Standards Australia provide track changes in documents as opposed to comparing the old and the new standard?
Yes.
Right.
So we have trial track changes on AS-NZS 3500 plumbing and draining. What we did in the trial was we actually provided the standards in two formats. One is to look at, here's what the new one would look like without the track changes. And in the second one, we took the existing text and we showed the proposed changes in track changes. And in collaboration with the Australian Building Codes Board, we've agreed that the future public comment documents referenced in the NCC will have track changes. Because I know when I get a document and my staff have made changes and they haven't used track changes, it drives me to distraction. So I understand that frustration that we need to do it. And certainly if there's other documents specifically that you'd like us to run through that pilot, but it will become, and it needs to become, our business as usual. So we're building that capability as part of our business transformation, and these pilots help us iron out the wrinkles in that process. So the answer is yes.
Well done, thank you. Now I move on to some questions for Neil Savery. Neil, following the release of the discussion paper on the feasibility of watermark point of sale, and you've addressed some of this already in your remarks, point of sale regulation and subsequent consultation process, has the ABCB formed a view on the way forward, and if so, will it share its conclusion with the forum? Is there any specific feedback on those who are not supporting point of sale and why? And I think the first part will be addressed.
Yeah, the first part I have addressed, but it just been clear the answer is no. The ABCB has not formed a view because the ABCB hasn't received the report. The office has, but not the board. But as I indicated, it raises significant policy issues for the states and territories. So it's my view that the board will then take the recommendations forward to the Building Ministers Forum, which won't meet again until probably August, September. And it'll be up to them as to what views they form around any significant policy issues that arise from that paper. The other thing I would say, Stuart, in response to the question, particularly around the availability of material coming out of it, is that a number of people who participated in the consultation made very clear that they were providing their information on a confidential basis. And that's going to make it very difficult to share all of the contents of the outcome of this work in a public sense. And my view would be that when a decision is made one way or the other, it'll have to be a heavily modified report that is provided probably just on the conclusions and the outcomes rather than the background content. And that's relevant in terms of your question around, are there any sort of initial indications? People have provided their comments, some, on a strictly confidential basis.
Okay, thank you, Neil. Your next question is, what is the current status of the proposed amendments to the NCC affecting Volume 3, and what have been the lessons learned from the process involved in the first 3-year NCC amendment cycle leading to NCC 2019?
So I'll focus on the second part of the question because I outlined earlier what the process is and where we're at, which will end with an amendment or changes to the code on the 1st of May 2019. In terms of lessons learnt, and we are interested in feedback from anyone on this, and we're in fact convening a workshop within the office in a few weeks' time where we've invited a representative of industry, a representative of Standards Australia, and one of the regulators to give us their perspective on the experience of the 3-year amendment cycle. I think one of the critical issues is just the sheer volume of what emerges at the end of that cycle. So for those of you who aren't familiar, up until now, or up until 2016, we had an annual amendment, which meant you had a relatively constant change and turnover of amendments to the code. And that was seen as unhelpful in a regulatory sense because it created a constant state of flux for industry and having to become familiar with changes to the system and to the code. But equally important for the office, it didn't give us the ability to focus on any substantial policy issues because all we were doing was focusing on very technical changes to the code. So significant policy issues never got the attention that they required. But as I say, what it has led to is just in that 3rd year, which is this year, just a huge volume of material change to the code that everyone has to become familiar with in order to comment on it and potentially start to think about how's this change going to impact on me. So I think, Stuart, one of the critical issues is how can we smooth this out over a 3-year period so that there isn't a peak and trough in terms of people getting involved in the process, and could we do it in a way that where there are discrete subjects, we'll call it, for instance, lead and water. You do that project, you consult on that project, and you have everything resolved so it's ready to adopt at the end of the 3-year cycle. But you don't hold it all in abeyance and package it up so that everything's being consulted on at the end of that, at the 3-year cycle, which is a huge burden upon everyone trying to familiarise themselves with all of that material. That's just one of the issues I think that's emerged.
Thanks, Neil. The next question, there has been some reference to the issue of standards, the interpretation of standards, but this is addressed to Neil also. Many standards are known to have clauses or requirements which can be interpreted in varying ways, particularly between different watermark gaps. Where such cases can be identified, would the ABCB be open to taking feedback on such requirements from standards to release a notice of direction where a common interpretation can be defined for all watermark cabs and all laboratories to follow unambiguously?
So a few comments. The ABCB is always open to people providing us with information and advice around interpretation ambiguities so that we can try and improve the nature of our material for the purposes of ensuring that we get high levels of compliance and the consumer gets the right outcomes. But I make the observation, which isn't flippant, regulation is imperfect, standards are imperfect. I don't know that even with the use of diagrams that not only is Standards Australia looking at, but the ABCB is looking at, that you will always be able to say that it's a perfect instrument for the purposes of what you're trying to achieve. Having said all of that, and particularly in the context of watermark, you heard me earlier talk about our review of watermark technical specifications. So it's important to draw the distinction between WMTSs, ATSs, which are Australian technical standards, and then an Australian/New Zealand standard. So if the ambiguity relates to the latter, that is a standard, that is a matter purely for Standards Australia. Don't raise it with us because we'll simply refer it to Standards Australia. That's their process. they will inevitably, I would imagine, Bronwyn talk to their standards committee to seek clarity around an ambiguous part of the standard. If it does relate to a WMTS or an ATS, then I'm indicating to you we're about to go through a fairly lengthy process of reviewing all of those. And that's a real opportunity as we engage with you, for you to tell us where there is any ambiguity in those documents. One of the other critical things in that process is that we've invited members of the Plumbing Codes Committee, which includes the PPIG, it includes the MPA, it includes AIG, to tell us what the priorities are. And we've said that to the regulators. Which are the priority WMTSs? So if there are significant issues of ambiguity, and you don't want to wait for the fourth year of us doing this review, tell us so that we get it elevated to the first year if there's something that's clearly a significant issue. The other thing I need to address in your question, Stuart, is that it isn't the role of notices of decisions or notices of direction to offer interpretation. That's not their role. It's really an instruction to CABs in particular, and potentially manufacturers of products that CABs certify, around the operation of the watermark scheme as from the owner's perspective. So if there is an obvious need to have a mechanism to deal with issues of ambiguity, then it may be something else that we actually have to create, Stuart. In the building system, we issue national advisory notes. And they're directed at practitioners, they're not directed at manufacturers of products.
Thanks, Neil. And finally, for Neil, I have a question. Has there been any further consideration to broadening the scope of the NCC to incorporate gas and electrical on-site construction requirements that have been historically planned as part of the future expanded NCC?
And the answer is yes, there has. But as with the case of bringing plumbing into the National Construction Code, it's never easy. Regulators are very protective of their patch. Industry is equally concerned about, does this mean a whole new world for us? Can we trust the ABCB? All of these kinds of things. So plumbing, as you know, did come into the National Construction Code back in 2011. And we're still pretty much, that's a work in progress. Well, in fact, codes are they never stop. With gas fitting, and I'll stress it's not gas across the board, it's specifically around gas fitting, so it's that link between plumbing and gas fitting. We did actually commence the process of looking at the feasibility of a gas fitting code. We got it to the point where we had even done a regulatory impact analysis, which was line ball as to the merits of including it into the code as opposed to leaving it where it is now. But then La Crosse happened, then Grenfell happened, so we parked it. We had higher order issues to deal with. We have indicated to the board, and it'll be for the board to consider at its meeting and then the BMF at its subsequent meeting, to include gas fitting, the establishment of a gas fitting code for NCC 2022. So that's not a commitment to do it, that's the commitment to, we will go through a process that will engage with the sector, and again, particularly the regulators, the gas regulators, to determine whether or not it ends up. Now, Stuart, depending on the outcomes of that process, and we have to have a decision one way or another by 2022, we will then determine whether we do electrical or not.
Thank you very much, Neil. Appreciate your responses. I'll now revert to Dr. Carol Grossman with some questions for her. And Carol, my first question is, what scope do you see for combining the management and administration and compliance requirements of the wells and watermark schemes, or at least an alignment of the application process for those products requiring both watermark and well site? Appreciate that you did address that to some extent earlier.
Thanks, Stuart. Yeah, look, we do get asked from time to time, why don't we merge with watermark? Why isn't it handled under one scheme? So I will address that first, and then I'll talk about I'll just reiterate what we're doing to try to get better alignment. I think part of the rationale comes back to me that if we did merge the schemes, I think the focus on water efficiency would be lost. It would become a sideline, and there might be still some benchmarks and minimum efficiencies, but you wouldn't get the encouragement of innovation and developing and installing more efficient products. But the other reason really comes back to our administrative arrangements and our sources of authority are quite different. Wells operates nationally, and that was because of getting agreement from all states and territories to run Wells as a national program. And it was interesting listening to Ivan this morning because it really relates back to that. The agreement to establish Wells as a national program happened in 2004 as part of the National Water Initiative. And it was essentially dealing with an emergency situation of the millennium drought, which showed no signs of coming to an end, and looking at how to manage water across jurisdictions. And so as part of that broader package of how do we manage water across jurisdictions, setting up wells as a way to manage urban demand came up. And because of that, we also have very different compliance and enforcement regimes because we can operate at a national scale and we do manage at point of sale. And I'd be reluctant to give that up. I think that's very effective. So I think there are some logical reasons for not merging the schemes. Having said that, as I mentioned in with my slides, we are working at making the registration process a lot more unified so that people have an option of going through cabs to do a one-stop registration process.
Thank you. And my next one's a little bit more detailed. Forgive me. Has there been any progress or developments in addressing the water efficiency requirements of AS 6400 and the requirements of the Plumbing Code of Australia? In essence, there's a misalignment between AS-ANZ 3500.1 and AS-ANZ 6400 with the flow rate requirements for tap equipment and showers. For example, 3500.1 2015 clause 321 requires that the maximum flow rate from a shower, basin and kitchen sink or laundry through the outlet shall not exceed 9 litres per minute. And 6400 2014 requires that the flow rates for 0, 1 and 2 well-star rated tap equipment and showers are greater than 9 litres per minute. This is creating challenges for products requiring watermark and wells. Is there any way forward?
Thanks, Stuart. And yeah, that is a tricky one for us. I suppose one of the issues is that Wells is generally seen as an information scheme. So it's about telling people what they're purchasing. And so we do rate products that have higher flow rates. Now, having said that, we do set minimum water consumption rates for washing machines and toilets. But on the other hand, those products have a clear task to do and they have to meet performance requirements. So as long as they achieve that, most consumers aren't too concerned about how much, there's no reason why a consumer would want a toilet that uses more water as long as the low flow one does the job at hand. So we do come in from that perspective of our job is to inform consumers. At the same time, we do want to have that alignment. And I guess it's been curious to us because we will only register plumbing products if the applicant provides a watermark certificate. So I guess we then look back and say, well, why can this get a watermark certificate if it exceeds the allowable flow rate? And that's also that 9 litres a minute is in the plumbing code. Because certainly if watermark put in that limitation, then we wouldn't register products that had more than 9 litres a minute. So I'm not really sure how we move forward from that. I think for Wells to sort of unilaterally say, well, we're going to put in this minimum efficiency, we'd have to go through the government's regulatory impact statement and the other processes where if you're adding a new regulation, you have to be removing a regulation from somewhere. And I'm not quite sure how we'd be able to do that or show that. Yeah, I'll pass that to Neil.
Thanks. I think the key thing here is to remember, as Carol just said, that it's the plumbing code that sets the minimum regulatory requirements. That's what you have to meet. So even though it would be ideal to have wells and wells and the plumbing code aligned on flow rates, flow rate under wells is a public information tool. So the thing that you have to meet is the plumbing code requirement. How you then display your product is the issue that Wells has to be satisfied you're doing, even though the flow rate may vary, as long as it's met the minimum requirements. But I think if there was a question mark about the alignment, it would ultimately be one where you would want to ensure that the minimum requirement in the Plumbing Code of Australia is the level that we want to set the benchmark at. And then rather than what I just heard Carol say quite correctly around wells going through regulatory impact, it would be the ABCB doing the regulatory impact for the purposes of ensuring that the correct minimum level is established within the Plumbing Code of Australia. Thanks.
Thank you, Neil, and thank you, Carol, for addressing that issue. And I guess, based on what Neil said, there is some scope for amendment and change going forward to address that issue, because it is causing some market confusion.
And can I just jump in and add to that? I think there's a parallel issue with the shower standard, the 3662, which there's a 2013 version that Wells requires because it has additional testing requirements for our 4-star showers. But Watermark still calls up the 2005 standard and says that they don't want to update to the later one because it doesn't have that 9 litres per minute restriction. So we do want to try and make some revisions, and we'll be talking to some of the staff at in the ABCB office to look at whether we can make some revisions so that we can have one standard that satisfies both.
Thanks, Carol. I think now we'll move on to Dr. James Galloway, and I have some questions for you, sir. As the accreditation body, do you consider that Australia has an adequate and effective conformity assessment infrastructure to support the plumbing sector and the Watermark scheme? Yes, please explain the basis for accreditation.
Thanks, Stuart. Look, in some respects, I guess the final word on this question should probably belong to Neil rather than to JAS-ANZ. But on balance, I'm going to say we do. We do have basically broadly sufficient, adequate conformity assessment infrastructure. That's not to claim that it's perfect or that mistakes aren't made, but I will assert that it's adequate. From an accreditation point of view, we have a system which is based on international standards. However we may choose to judge the adequacy of those standards, and it is peer reviewed from time to time. And on numerous occasions, that peer review process has established that the conformity assessment in Australia and New Zealand satisfies the condition for recognition by overseas trading partners. So that's one aspect of it. I think the other aspect is that the scheme and its basic parameters were developed by the ABCB following what was quite an open and honestly critical review of the pre-existing scheme. And I think that ultimately adds to our understanding of the adequacy and operation of the scheme. Strengths, if I were to express it, I think Watermark, maybe imperfectly, does have a reasonably good, if partly informal system for development and application of interpretations. We take an awful lot of inquiries from people about what does this mean, how do you apply this. We have a process by which we'll talk that through with the ABCB, and then either through JAS-ANZ or through the ABCB, information is fed back to actually try and settle those sorts of questions. That's a big contrast for us compared to some other schemes where that sort of thing doesn't happen. I think we can do it a lot better, but it is, in my view, still a strength of the Watermark scheme relative to others. I think the scheme can deal quite successfully with both standard and innovative product, and that's a great strength in this day and age. And there are some common elements to the scheme. There are decisions made about how the scheme should operate and how the conformity assessment discipline should be applied within the scheme. And that, I think, does work to limit the extent of variation in conformity assessment practice, and it does limit, does it rule out, gaming of the scheme by industry. So they're the strengths, I think. Vulnerabilities, standards, they don't always lend themselves to international application. And then I think that's probably a problem we're always going to live with. It's a communication problem. It's not necessarily a technical problem. It's never going to go away. By and large, when I look at the standards organisations that we deal with, Standards Australia is right up there in terms of trying to address these problems when they occur. And that's really all we can ask. Test reports, another vulnerability. Probably one of my biggest concerns is test reports that are coming into certification decision making. We see them coming in with incredibly long lines. We see them coming in relating to product produced in one factory, but the product that wants to be certified comes from another factory. All sorts of gaming to try and get test reports into it. We've seen falsified test reports. We've seen test reports for products which have got no relation to the product which has been put forward for certification. And there is a real issue to be addressed here. Some of it I think is quite willful, some of it is quite genuine mistakes, but you know, we need to get really a little bit more rigorous about what we're prepared to accept as testing data that's going to support certification decisions. And then the other vulnerability is that despite our efforts and everyone else's efforts, careless certification decisions do still get made. And we've got to look at what we can do within the machinery available to us to limit that. Taking those things into account, I'm still prepared to assert that Watermark doesn't do a bad job at all. Right? There are the outliers, but you know, the bulk of it seems to work quite well. The basis for accreditation, how do we go about it? Well, basically it's a regular, even continuous process of testing a series of activities within the certification body. So how do they go about selecting the characteristics of the product that will be assessed, and how do they effectively assess those product characteristics? How do they determine if the product meets specific characteristics as established through some reliable body of testing data, measurement or inspection data? How do they actually gather, assemble and make use of evidence? And then probably most importantly, we look at the integrity of decision making. Right? And that's decision making at several levels within the certification body. Decisions about the extent of manufacturing surveillance that's carried out. How do they rationalise the product sampling that's to be applied in the certification regime, as well as the actual certification decision itself? Is it adequately supported by evidence? Is it taken under conditions which are going to ensure impartiality and by a competent decision maker?
Thank you, James. The next question is, with respect to Watermark conformity assessment bodies, who is policing, who is auditing, how does JAS-ANZ audit the Watermark cabs, and how and when does that occur? What triggers an audit, and what is the result if the Watermark cab is not compliant?
Okay. All right, so how does JAS-ANZ audit the Watermark cabs? How and when does this occur? All right. So they're assessed on a regular basis. We use the term assessment rather than audit. It starts from the time someone applies. We have a pre-application process, and that seeks to answer the question, do they look like they're an acceptable risk? Said before, a cab is not a customer, a cab is a risk to JAS-ANZ. Okay, that's how we view it. They then go through an application process. In that application process, they're required to put forward system documentation, which essentially is a quite comprehensive, documented description of how they intend to go about product certification. That is aimed to answer for us the question, do they demonstrate adequate understanding of what they're getting into? They review their management system. Are the intended activities adequately documented? Do the auditors actually apply the CAB system as documented? So we'll go and witness the performance of an auditor in some context or another. We do office assessment, which is basically, is the office that's directing the certification activity following its own procedures. And then, assuming that's all satisfactory, we'll go through a process of entering into an accreditation deed. Right? And that's not guaranteed. I have the capacity to basically say, even after all of that assessment, if there are doubts that arise, I'm not obliged to accredit anyone. There is no obligation on me to put a signature on that deed. If some other piece of information emerges from the market which actually challenges or upsets that assessment result, that process from application to signing the deed takes about 8 to 12 months for an individual cap, and it's repeated every 4 years. In between that 4-year period, there is regular surveillance. So surveillance occurs either on a 3-monthly basis, a 6-monthly basis, a 12-monthly basis, 18 months or 24 months. If you look at the whole population of accredited certification bodies, not just watermark bodies, we currently have 6 bodies who we visit every 3 months. We have 89 that we look at every 6 months. We've got 53 that we visit every 12 months. We've got 14 that we visit every 18 months. And there are 2 that we visit every 24 months. Okay? That frequency is an indicator of our confidence in the CAB. 12 months is about our median level of performance. 3 and 6 months, we've got some concerns, and they're basically on notice to lift their game at a number of different levels. As well as using that sort of assessment data and reaching those conclusions about frequency of surveillance, we also try and draw information from our complaints process and market feedback to get a fuller picture. So my question for you, I'm not going to identify where the watermark cabs sit on that frequency table, but if you knew where the watermark cabs were located on that distribution, would that actually influence your decision about where you took your certification dollar? Because I'm really interested in that. Because that's where we want to go with this notion of publishing a ranked listing of certifiers. And I guess the other question that follows on from that is, if the process of feedback was open, right, would you actually contribute feedback to that? Because this has been a bit of a bone of contention in the past where we've looked at this and people have been prepared to give us stories under the table, but not necessarily prepared to give us anything that was actionable. Okay? And that's a really important distinction. You know, anecdote is one thing, but information which is actionable is another thing. And we really need to be focusing on the latter.
There are a couple of good questions, James, and perhaps we could advise you independently of this forum.
Well, Stuart, I'm totally relying on the likes of yourself and James Thompson to have a fairly free and frank discussion with me about how we open that up. Yep. Just to finish off, we also have a range of unscheduled activities that we can carry out. Forensic audit, which is a really deep dive into a certification decision, a really deep dive. And a somewhat, how can you put it, a disturbing activity for a CAB to go through. It really gets to the heart of whether there was sufficient information to make that certification decision. Generally, they're triggered by complaints. We've got a substantiated complaint or a piece of market information, which really raises concerns about the adequacy of that particular certification decision. We can do validation visits, and this is mainly relevant to the management systems environment, but we actually can go to the certified organisation and look at whether the certification body has in fact put a legitimate audit in place, and the evidence on the ground suggests that there is a valid certification system there. And the last mechanism would be product reference group. I think I gave you a fair appraisal of our expertise. Right? We're not plumbing experts. We never have pretended to be. We never will pretend to be. We do have people that we have access to who can assist us in that regard. And we're now looking at using the product reference group as a way of putting a full certification file in front of an expert and peer group to ask the question of whether that certification decision was justified. And what are the results? Well, if they're not compliant. The whole system is predicated on the idea of improvement. Right? So the first set of consequences lies in a set of findings being put to a certification body and then being required to implement some sort of corrective action. And we follow that up through subsequent surveillance activities. If it's a little bit more serious than that, we use a mechanism of show cause. Tell us why we shouldn't suspend you because of X, Y, Z. And suspension means that that cab is no longer entitled to seek new business. It must continue to service its existing clients, but it cannot seek new business. And we police that quite seriously. If the terms of suspension are not met, then we go to withdrawal, which essentially means that under the deed we move to sever our relationship with that cab. There are some conditions where we don't necessarily have to follow those steps because they are escalation steps, and that's cancellation. And cancellation basically, if there is willful fraudulent activity, if a significant regulatory body, for instance, has found the cab to be wanting and afforded them natural justice through their processes, then I have the capacity simply to cancel the relationship with the certifier without the need for JAS-ANZ to extend them further due process. Now, any cab that comes to us knows that that's the scenario that they face.
Thanks, James. Neil, you'd like to make a comment?
Thanks. I just wanted to add to James' observations because people may not be aware that the office is a primary source of intelligence for JAS-ANZ in terms of any audit activities it might undertake. And that, of course, is as a result of complaints that potentially come to us. But someone asked the question before in terms of the expertise that might be available to the regulators. We have a team of 4 people, 2 of whom are plumbing practitioners, one a hydraulic engineer, one a licensed plumber, so they are experts in this field. But also bear in mind, this is an administrative matter. So having a person who understands administrative practice is also quite essential, and they're an expert in their field as well. But I want to stress, as owner of the scheme, we have a great deal of faith and collaborate very closely with JAS-ANZ in these processes, and I don't think people can possibly appreciate the amount of work that goes on behind the scenes in trying to ensure that, as best as possible, we can be confident that the certificates that are being issued, the products that are on the market, are what they say they are. It's a huge and exhausting undertaking when you think about there's something in excess of 60,000 products that we're dealing with, and of course that grows as new products come into the marketplace. But I also want to make the point, and James made reference to this, we deal with an inordinate number of vexatious complaints from product manufacturers trying to outdo another product manufacturer. All that does is take our resources away from where the real issues are. So just think about that when you want to try and get one up on your competitor. That's what you're doing. And we work out what the game is, and we dismiss it. But you've wasted a lot of resources in doing that. Okay? Thanks.
No, that's not bloody okay.
No.
Well, we spend a lot of money on watermarking that. You didn't answer the question, where do we go to? Do we go to you? I asked this question 2 years ago, never got an answer.
It depends on the nature of the issue. So the primary focus of the ABCB will be around a complaint regarding a process that hasn't been properly. So if you go to the scheme rules clearly articulate what the process is, including the escalation after you've dealt with that. So you've been to the cab, you haven't got satisfaction with the cab, you elevate that, and depending on what the specific nature of the issue is, it'll either be the ABCB or JAS-ANZ. And depending on who you come to, we'll sort it out amongst ourselves as to which of us is most appropriately placed to take that matter forward.
We have,
Look, I'm sorry, ladies and gentlemen, we're really running out of time, and whilst I'd love to have an open question period, perhaps you can speak with our panellists during the break, and I'm sorry we are out of time. I thank our panellists very much for their time and their contribution today. I think it's been very interesting and enlightening and educational, and as I say, I'm sorry we don't have an opportunity for greater questions, so if you can join me in thanking